Looking for fascinating conversations with industry thought leaders? Want to get the inside scoop from local legends? Interested in the stories behind the stories from celebrated visionaries? This is your home for the best our university has to offer. Welcome to We Are IU.
We live in an age when power is increasingly exercised through code, when everything from your gym shorts to your washing machine, your car, is a computer connected to the internet. What does it mean then to be human in this digital age? And what kind of digital society do we want to live in? And what type of agency do we all have to exercise in shaping it? I'm honored today to be joined by two leaders whose work lives at the intersection of law, policy, emerging technology, and public service. First, we have Daryl M. West. Dr. West is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution and the founding director of its Center for Technology and Innovation. He's a leading voice on the intersection of technology, policy, and governance with influential work on AI, data policy, democracy, and the future of work. He's authored more than 20 books, including The Future of Work and Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, and he frequently has advised governments and institutions on emerging tech regulation. Daryl is joined by Vicki Allums. Vicki serves as the Associate General Counsel at the Defense Information Systems Agency, DISA, where she provides expert legal guidance on cybersecurity, acquisition, and intellectual property. With over 2 decades in federal service, she's shaped IP strategy and tech policy across multiple defense and civilian agencies. She's a recognized leader in the field. She was honored with Indiana University's Distinguished Alumni Service Award for her contribution to public service, national security, and innovation in the federal technology landscape. Now, the most important thing I can say about both of them is that they're both IU alums. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you. Thank you. I also want to add that I'm currently the learning director for intellectual property at Defense Acquisition University, which is one of DoD's universities. And I have oversight over the intellectual property curriculum and as work to establish the program at DAU. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I'll dive right in. And so to both of you, I'm just really curious about the things that keep you up at night. And so when you look at the intersection of emerging technology, law, governance, what's the single most consequential trend or risk that you think is underappreciated right now?
I think the thing that keeps me up is just the rapid pace of deployment of so many different AI applications. I mean, AI is really transforming virtually every sector: education, healthcare, transportation, e-commerce, and the list goes on. And the problem right now is private companies are basically innovating with very little public oversight. Like, there's very little regulation, very few policies in place to deal with this. We know that there's going to be possible job impact. People are going to lose positions because of AI. There are threats in terms of privacy, cybersecurity, human safety, and so on. And personally, I would like to see a little more public oversight. You know, when you think about every other area, finance, education, healthcare, there are some regulations in place just to make sure any new innovation respects human values. And I think we need more of that in the AI area, just to make sure we get the positive uses and not the negative applications.
Right. And let's dive a little bit deeper into that question about the tensions between innovation happening in commercial spaces and the need for government to keep up, if you will. I mean, you've written extensively about how democratic institutions struggle to keep pace with the rapid technological change. So especially in this context, like what should be done? Like, how do we change that?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The government is severely lagging the private sector, both in the use of technology, but also in the rules governing those applications. This is not uncommon. Like, you can go back to the early days of automobiles. The same thing happened the early days of television, the early days even of the internet itself. Like, that has always been the case. But what typically happens is, as new innovations spread, there always are problems. Like, cars started to have accidents and people were getting injured. And so eventually the public weighs in. They're worried about the negative impact of these new applications, and they demand more oversight. So I think we're at the beginning stages of that. States and localities actually are taking action. There are a number of states that actually have passed legislation, but we've not seen any action from Congress. So I would just like to see them kind of take their oversight responsibilities more seriously.
Well, and one final question, and then I'll jump over to Vicky, which is we have seen, or at least the beginning of some action in this in the current legislation that's being discussed right as we're on camera today with the big beautiful bill. There's this small provision that says that states are not able to make any regulations around artificial intelligence for the next 10 years. Thoughts on that approach, because that seems to sort of address the tension that we're trying to bring up here head on by saying, actually, we don't want companies to be regulated, particularly not at the state level.
We have to keep in mind a 10-year moratorium in regard to AI is an eternity. Like, it'll be way too late if we have no human guardrails in place for the next 10 years. And there are a lot of states, both liberal and conservative states, that have actually passed laws to protect privacy, help protect users in terms of cybersecurity, kind of deal with some of the job market aspects of this. And there's a whole history of American federalism where the national government doesn't dictate to the states what they do. Like, the Constitution actually reserves a lot of rights to states and localities. And I think in regard to the internet and AI in particular, states are regulating, and Congress should let them do that. So I hope that particular 10-year moratorium gets dropped from final passage of this legislation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, Vicky, turning to you, curious on the same thing. What keeps you up at night?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. Very interesting and challenging subject. I have to say, before I say anything, that all of my views are my personal views and are not the views of my employer, the Department of Defense, or Defense Acquisition University, which is my direct employer. I'll tell you the thing that keeps me up about this. As Daryl said, it's not as if technology hasn't evolved over the centuries. I mean, it has. We started out with manufacturing, and then we went to an information age. And what you're seeing, I think, with AI, I'm an attorney, and I was an attorney when they were discussing, and actually attended some of the hearings on Capitol Hill when they were looking at legislating the internet, especially from the copyright area. I'm an intellectual property lawyer. And there was a lot of discussion between industry and government in terms of, so much of this is impacted by the business sector. They run the technology, they develop the technology, but government has an oversight responsibility, as Daryl has mentioned. And one of the issues that you always have is that tension between industry, which is out to provide great technology for consumers, for people in our country, but then you have to have some oversight. And I think the issue with AI is it has evolved very fast, as we've talked about. Not only has it evolved very fast, but technology always outpaces the law. That's one big issue. And in this area, there are so many competing interests, which we also saw when they were discussing internet technology. There are a lot of competing interests. So you have consumers who use the technology. You have companies who their businesses are built on this technology. And then the other thing that I think you have to throw into this, which was also an issue when we were talking about internet regulation and legislation, this is a global issue. It impacts us within the United States as consumers, but also our adversaries are looking at how they can use this technology against us. And so when you have all of these competing interests, within the country in terms of developing a domestic law, it's difficult because you have challenges. And I think states, you're right, the states are really out front and leading on this. But because this is a global issue, and because this is an issue that impacts all consumers, at some point you're going to have some federal legislation. And it's how you go about doing that. If you look at, I think privacy laws are a perfect example. Privacy laws are really sector-based now. So you've got laws that deal with HIPAA, the healthcare industry, or laws that deal with businesses or education, FERPA. So you have all of these laws that are very sector based, and it's difficult. It's been very difficult for us to legislate on a federal level a comprehensive privacy law. And one of the issues about that, one of the challenge there is difficult to get all of these competing interests together so that you come out with a law that everybody's going to be able to accept. And that's why it's much easier to do it on the state level. And so I think that's why you're seeing state legislation. But at some point, we're going to have a domestic comprehensive federal law dealing with this. I think a couple of years ago during the writer's strike, the copyright law, there was a lot of discussion about whether we amend the copyright law to address AI and the possibility that it could impact creative jobs. And, there was some discussion. The companies were saying, well, but, this is new technology. You impact our ability to be able to do what we do as companies. We made this technology. This is our asset. And then consumers are saying, especially people who were writers were saying, but the ability to exploit my work and take away my ability to make a job, to make a living is a real issue. We saw these exact same discussions with internet legislation. I think the difficulty with AI is how fast it's moving, and the fact that it has potential good uses, but also potential negative uses. And so getting all of those competing interests at the table and getting some type of passing some type of comprehensive federal legislation, we have to do it, but it's definitely going to be a challenge.
I want to come back here in a little bit to this question, this tension between creativity. I think you've identified a really clear gap in our governance of AI around IP law, which I really love to pick your brain on. But before that, asking both of you, what other gaps do you see right now in terms of regulation? I mean, so we talked in general about how we need to perhaps be more proactive in regulating artificial intelligence, but where do you start? What outside of IP and copyright, what other things would you want to be regulating?
Well, one of the things we talked about, privacy laws. I think there's such an intersection with privacy and information in AI, because AI is really all about the data. It's the data, they say it's whatever data you put in, that's what you're going to get, that's going to spit out, as some folks have termed it. So it's all about the data. AI is effective because the internet, there's data everywhere. I mean, all of that information, a lot of that information, a lot of folks would argue that is really private information that is out there. And so AI is able to pull that information. So you have the privacy issue. Then the other issue you have is an ethical issue. How that data, because it is based on the data that's there, how that data is used, how that data is manipulated, and what it spits out in terms of what's generated by AI technology. So I think the ethics issue, I think the privacy issue is a big issue. And in our country, I think I said at our discussion when we did this live, I did a master's on cybersecurity and government information leadership. And as part of my capstone project, one of the things I looked at was the privacy legislation and why we have such a difficult time in the United States really coming up with a comprehensive privacy law. As I said, it's all sector based. And one of the issues that we talked about a lot with my professors who were working with me on this capstone project was that the tension there with businesses being able to use that information. And, if you go to the internet and all of these apps that you click on, there's actually a privacy statement on there, but it's in such small writing that most people don't take the time to look at it, where it says you can opt out of this. And so that's kind of the discussion that you have. And so companies say, well, we look at those ethical issues, we look at those privacy issues. As a consumer, you can opt out of this if you want to.
Okay, but that gets to something that Daryl was speaking about in terms of the demand amongst residents and citizens asking for more accountability. Like, Daryl, I'm curious for you to weigh in here too. I mean, yes, in the broader question of what other gaps do you see, but from my perspective, I don't think that the general public cares all that much about privacy. What do you think, Daryl?
I mean, if you look at public opinion surveys, privacy is actually at the top of the list of people's complaints. So they often don't act on that in their lives, in the sense, they're living so much of their lives online. So you're right that sometimes they don't practice what they actually preach. But I think people are concerned, and I certainly agree with Vicky that we do need a national privacy law just to protect the confidentiality of people's information. But the other area that I would highlight where it's not really a question of a need for more regulation, but we need more research and analysis. Is just the AI impact on the workforce. There's just a lot of concern about possible job losses from AI, and especially in terms of entry-level positions. So I know at Indiana University, we have new graduates who are going on the market, and I know just from talking with young people in my own circle, a lot of them are having difficulties getting that first job. Now, once you have the first job, everything gets easier. It's easier to get that second, third, and fourth job, but getting that first job can be rough. And AI is now really good at many of the tasks in entry-level jobs, administrative tasks, record keeping, data analysis, even doing research. There are AI applications that can do a literature review and kind of summarize what's going on. So I think we just need to understand how AI is affecting the workforce already, make sure we have good job training programs in place so that people who either aren't able to get the jobs or are losing jobs get retrained, that their skills are upgraded so that they can qualify for higher level jobs that are going to be out there.
Hmm. So the last follow up on this line of thinking. So we've spoken a little bit about the type of things that we'd like to that we think we need regulations or rules around. Where might you invest, if in a budget bill, for example, to make us ready for the AI age? Vicky, your thoughts?
As I was saying, where might you invest? I'll be honest with you. In terms of the job discussion, colleges and universities, administrators of colleges and universities are really beginning to look at this issue in terms of how they prepare, especially students that just graduate from college, who are not able to get those entry-level jobs, and the fear that AI may replace them. And so the studies have said that if you look at AI, the jobs that you're looking at in terms of the skill set that AI will not be able to replace. And I think that the best way to put it is, you're always going to need a human in the loop for some positions, because AI really it's based on the data that's there. It's sort of a repetitive mechanism. But if you need somebody to really sort of do the additional step of analysis and reasoning, those soft skills that we all learn about, especially if you have a liberal arts degree as an undergrad, as I do, those soft skills will be really important. Communication, writing skills, very good teamwork, those skills that you're going to need. And so looking at really deciding or evaluating which jobs will require those type of skill sets is what we have to look at. And so what colleges and universities are beginning to do now is say, how do I prepare my students to make sure that they have those kind of skills, so that we know what jobs AI will not replace, what type of skills will my students need when they go out, what kind of jobs will they be able to get, not only get. And I'll tell you, one of the other things that the way colleges and universities are looking at this is, you have to be a lifelong learner. You've got to be able to adapt. So whatever skills or jobs that are coming in the future that AI will not be able to replace, all of us will have to continually to adapt and to adjust our skills in order to be able to compete for the jobs of the future, which AI, I think, will not replace. I think I said during our live session on this, I was at an event back at Oxford a couple of years ago where we were talking about, and one of the professors said, well, there's going to have to be some type of living wage or universal income, I think is what he said, because AI is going to replace so many jobs. And then we talked a lot about for wealthy countries, even that would be a step to be able to create a universal income for its citizens. But think about poor countries and developing countries, that would be absolutely impossible. So you would have all of these people that would be unemployed. So that's one way to look at it. How do you overcome that? And then I think the second step to look at it is with the internet. There are a lot of jobs now that didn't exist before the internet. So this may be an opportunity to really sort of look at new types of jobs that could be generated out of this type of AI technology. So I think there are some opportunities here, as well as some concerns about job replacement.
Okay, but let's query that point about the human in the loop. How I mean, do you agree with that assessment, Daryl, that there's always gonna need a human in the loop, or is that more sort of up to the choices that we make as a society? I'm particularly concerned about this push. In the longest time, we thought about general AI or strong AI as this sort of far off way of structuring our thinking around AI development. But now you have credible people talking about we're a few years, maybe 5, off of being able to create something approximating general AI. I'm curious about whether you do think that there are some human specialties that that are going to be insulated from this push, or is everything at risk?
Well, healthcare is definitely an area where we need to keep humans in the loop, and where I think we actually will. Just the task of caregiving, diagnosing illnesses, figuring out how to treat them. Like, AI can augment the performance of doctors and nurses, and help them stay up to date on the latest treatments. But I think all of us still want to be treated by doctors and nurses and not an AI algorithm. So there are definitely going to be areas that will be outside of this revolution to some extent. And I agree with Vicki, the need to invest in education is important. Just the whole talent upgrading, lifelong learning, like all those things, I think are going to be very important in this digital era. In the private sector, where places are going to need to invest is really in data centers, because all of these new AI applications rest on data centers with advanced computing capabilities that can perform these computations in split seconds. Data centers are really expensive. They are energy hogs. They take a lot of electricity. There's some local communities that have a lot of data centers where the data centers are taking a quarter of the local electrical needs of that entire community. So there is going to be a role for the government to help private industry develop these data centers, to take care of the energy needs, and to basically build the general infrastructure that we need for a digital economy.
Thank you both so much. So I'd like to come back to something that we were talking about earlier, as relates to humans and creativity, which I think is sort of a natural place to go from what we're talking about. Like, what is it that makes us human? And Vicki, you mentioned the need for an update to our IP laws, and IP law generates from this idea that we should protect human creativity as the sort of basis of all innovation and progress. How do you deal with IP in the age of generative AI?
That's a $1 million question, and the reason I say that is because you can look at all of the policy discussions that the agencies in the U.S. government, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, which is the executive level agency that addresses intellectual property. The U.S. Copyright Office. The Copyright Office is actually under the legislative branch, and so the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has the general authority for IP law. Although copyright is the copyright, because it's part of the executive branch, the Copyright Office is heavily involved in all these issues as well. But they've all done studies. You can go on their websites and see all of these studies that they've done. And what they've done is they've looked at it as a policy issue first, to see what are the policy concerns that are raised by IP and AI. So I attended back in 2019 a session at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and this was a session that was open to international participants as well. So there were a lot of folks from all over the globe, as well as U.S. lawyers and practitioners who were in this session, really raising the issue about what do we need to do in terms of our legislation within the United States to address AI? And that's been an ongoing discussion really for the last 6 years. The hearings that I talked about that happened probably 2 years ago on Capitol Hill, where you had some of the creative folks, authors, and then the people who are actors were concerned, well, writers actually, who were concerned about AI and the ability for folks to come along and use AI technology and create their work. I think for IP law, I'm a policy person, so it's right to look at it from a policy issue first to see what the concerns are and how you go about addressing them, and then change the law as it's necessary. But I think the tension that's going to be in this area is eventually we will have some type of laws that will deal with AI and copyright. And the concern, as the concern was when we were talking about the internet, creative authors were concerned that someone could come along, take their work, and you see the same thing. There have been some infringement copyright infringement lawsuits from two perspectives in terms of AI and copyright law. The first has been, if AI infringes my copyright data, so that data that's out there on the internet, we said it's all about the data, and somebody uses that in AI technology, well, then who's liable? So that's one issue, that's on the table. Who's responsible for that? It was the same type of issue when we were looking at the internet legislation, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was passed, where basically it was passed on to not necessarily internet service providers. They basically said, we're going to put up a notice and takedown procedure. And that's kind of the gist of what that law says is, so you notify us that's an issue, we look into it, and then we take it down. So it puts a lot of responsibility on the person who has the copyright holder to notify them that there's a potential issue, and then they work that. Something like that may happen with AI. I think the thing with AI is there's so much data that's out there. So when I'm at a university and when we talk about AI, my advice is always to look at the data, to do your sort of due diligence, so that you look at that data and make sure that it's not infringing anybody's copyrighted work. So that's the first issue. And then I think the second issue is really a big issue about if you use that data, the sort of the liability issue, where who assumes the liability if the copyrighted work is infringing. So I always say to folks, be diligent in terms of looking at the data, making sure that you've done your due diligence and looking at where that data is coming from to make sure that nobody's copyrighted work is infringed. I think this is going to be a challenging issue in terms of how you legislate it domestically. And then, as I always come back to the international part of this, we'll eventually have to have some international rules too, in terms of how we deal with countries and how they deal with AI and sort of the potential of infringing on somebody's IP. It's challenging, but we did it in the internet world. I think we'll be able to do it here. It's just going to take some cooperation amongst sort of looking at us domestically, but also looking at us internationally in terms of what laws we end up with.
Okay, so we're coming real close to the end here. So I'm going to ask you both a series of rapid fire questions here. And then I have one sort of closing question for us, but I'll start with you, Daryl. What do you worry more about? Bad actors gaming the system or good actors with bad tools?
I worry about bad actors gaming the system. And it's not just an American problem. Like, these are all international issues. And the problem is geopolitics all around the world has just grown so complicated, and there are new rivalries, new competitions in a lot of countries. And countries are now weaponizing the whole information area. Like during the Cold War, we reached treaties with the Soviet Union on the use of biological agents, chemical warfares. We limited the number of nuclear warheads just because we knew how destructive they were. And we actually need the same type of agreements now in terms of digital warfare. like countries should agree not to attack the critical infrastructure of their adversaries. We should not be taking down the power systems or the electric grids or the banking systems of any other country. Like that is an act of war in the same way that a bombing attack on another country would be an act of war. So I think that there are a lot of malicious actors out there who are weaponizing digital tools for very bad purposes. And we need to come together and basically reach an agreement on what are acceptable uses of new technologies and what are unacceptable uses.
Next question. If you were rewriting the Bill of Rights in the digital age, what's the First Amendment? That's for you, Daryl.
I was hoping you would ask Vicki that question. Because that's a very hard
maybe
question.
a better way of asking the question is would you add new amendments to the U.S. Bill of Rights to reflect the time that we're living in?
Well, I like the First Amendment. I think it actually offers a lot of protections, but we need to extend the First Amendment protections that have been designed for a physical world for a digital era. I think we've actually been slow to do that. Like if you just take the issue of crime, like it used to be people rob banks because, as Willie Sutton said, that's where the money is. Now all the crime is moving online, scams and phishing attacks and identity theft and basically compromising people's bank accounts in all sorts of ways. So we actually have laws in place, but we need to figure out how to apply them for the digital problems that we are seeing.
Awesome. Thank you. Rapid fire for you, Vicki. What emerging role or job in government do you think that the government will need but hasn't defined yet?
Oh, I think there's so many out there. I'll be honest with you. I've spoken on this a lot with other organizations that I'm involved in, and I'll be honest with you. I think into the O'Neill School, the skills that we get at the O'Neill School in terms of adaptability, in terms of policy analysis, in terms of looking at an issue and being able to discuss with the team the possible solutions and looking at all the possible ins and outs of that particular issue. I think that skill set, again, it's those soft skills, that is critically needed. I'll tell you, I think a multidisciplinary approach, which is also the O'Neill School's approach. Years ago, when I was a student there, they taught everything in our program from really a multidisciplinary approach. And I think AI absolutely requires that. This is a team sport where you've got to have all of these people who are subject matter experts, whether it's from the technical side, the legal side, the policy side, the business side, industry, academia, government, all working together. And so I think jobs that require that type of skill set, the policy analysis, is really going to be critical, because a lot of this is more than just the technical side of AI. This is really those critical sort of high level issues that you've got to think about and analyze. And that really requires, I think, a strong background in sort of policy analysis, data science, written communications, teamwork, all of the stuff that you get at the O'Neill School, I think will be critical for jobs of the future. And I'll tell you, I think a lot of the folks who look at this issue are saying the government has got to look at what kinds of jobs require that skill set, however you title them. And I think, that's a big part of, I think, what you're asking is, what will these jobs be called in the future? The jury is still out on that, but I think folks know enough about the skill sets that we know what we're going to have. And I honestly believe, and I always put a plug in for the O'Neill School, because I think they were so ahead of the curve in looking at this very early on. I think Indiana University and its focus on the global nature of what we do is another part of this discussion, as Daryl just mentioned a minute ago, in terms of this is a global issue. I think all of the skills that we get at Indiana University are really critical for us being able to tackle this and help the government figure out what kind of workers it will need in the future to really deal with these issues.
Awesome. Okay, so my very last question here to both of you is we've spent a lot of time talking about the things that worry us about artificial intelligence, but we haven't had space to talk about the things that we're excited about. And so I'd be curious to hear a handful of things that excite you about the AI age, AI possibilities, AI applications. What space are you focused on? Start with you, Vicky.
Yes, that's a great question. I think AI offers an enormous wealth of opportunities. I think in medical analysis and research, there's been a lot of discussion about how AI can be used to detect patterns in diseases developing in human bodies, and that's a really incredible potential use of AI. I think the other thing in terms of cybersecurity, the intersection of AI and cybersecurity, AI may be used to really help really identify some of those patterns, to identify bad actors who may be engaged in data breaches. And so I think those are two critical areas that will be enormously helpful. And then I think the other thing is just the potential of new job opportunities in this area that we haven't even thought about. Same thing as I said earlier about the internet. There are so many jobs that didn't exist prior to the age of the internet, and I think the same thing with AI. We're afraid because there could be job losses, but I also think the job opportunities. So health benefits, enormous cybersecurity, I think, and just the enormous potential of new jobs that we haven't thought about.
Awesome, Darren.
I would agree with Vicky. There are lots of exciting applications, and healthcare is certainly one of those areas. Like, you can use AI to discover new drug combinations that can treat illnesses. So I think there are lots of exciting uses there. The other area that I would highlight is just in terms of conserving and protecting our natural resources. So you can use satellite imagery to keep track of elephant herds in Africa, for example, and basically see where the herds are thinning rapidly, which probably indicates there's serious poaching that is going on. And so I think that's a great use of technology just to help protect elephants and other species that are at risk. So there actually are lots of very positive AI uses that people should keep in mind as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. There are a host of other topics that we didn't have time to get to, such as the agentic capabilities of artificial intelligence, thinking about cybersecurity in an age where there's a lot of mistrust and data and so on. But I think that we've started, a really good foundation for future conversations. And so I hope that people will join us again for this podcast. Thank you to IU for hosting us.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of We Are IU, your home for fascinating conversations with thought leaders, legends, and visionaries from the university we know and love. New episodes available monthly at myiu.org.